The hearing room was supposed to represent the highest ideals of democratic scrutiny, a place where truth was separated from political posturing, where sworn officials faced the most fundamental expectation placed upon public servants, honesty before the American people. Yet, as the confrontation unfolded between Representative Madeleine Dean and Attorney General Pam Bondi, that ideal collapsed in real time. What should have been a clear, rational exchange about ethics, conflict of interest, and the integrity of the Justice Department became instead a vivid display of evasion, deflection, and the crumbling credibility of one of the most powerful figures in the federal government. This moment, as heated as it was revealing, did not arise from partisanship, but from the glaring contrast between what the administration claims and what it actually does. And that contrast began with a single, pointed question. How can an administration that pardoned every January 6th offender pretend to stand on the side of law enforcement? Representative Dean's opening frame was not rhetorical. It was anchored in the lived experiences of officers who stood on the steps of the Capitol that terrible day. Officers who were beaten, crushed, sprayed, dragged, and traumatized. Officers who later died. Officers whose families lived with the unending aftermath of a political assault that shook the country to its core. Dean evoked these realities not for dramatic effect, but to illuminate the profound contradiction in Bondi's repeated claims that her Justice Department is committed to protecting law enforcement. It is an unavoidable inconsistency. A government cannot claim to defend the rule of law while simultaneously absolving, in one sweeping gesture, the individuals who shattered it. Bondi's response, or more accurately, her refusal to respond, revealed something deeper than uncomfortable politics. It revealed the institutional instinct to avoid accountability. Her insistence that she would not discuss conversations with the president was technically permissible, yet morally hollow. Public officials have invoked executive privilege before, but rarely has it been used as blatantly as a shield from ethical responsibility. This wasn't national security. This wasn't classified information. This was a question of whether the chief law enforcement officer of the United States offered any professional guidance on a decision that rewrote history and rewired justice. And Bondi could not answer, because the answer, whatever it was, would have exposed the administration's disregard for the principles the Justice Department is supposed to uphold. But the hearing did not unravel solely on the grounds of the January 6 pardons. It shifted, sharply, tellingly, into the arena of personal conflicts of interest. And it was here that the public witnessed an even more unsettling truth. The loose, increasingly porous boundaries between private influence and public power inside the current administration. Dean's second line of questioning was simple, factual, rooted in documentation, not ideology. Have you ever been registered as an agent of a foreign principal under the Foreign Agents Registration Act? It was a question with a known answer. Bondi had represented Qatar, and the legal paperwork existed. Yet instead of acknowledging it plainly, she attempted to reshape the narrative mid-testimony, reframing her role as anti-human trafficking work for the World Cup, a description crafted to sound humanitarian, apolitical, and uncontroversial. In reality, representing a foreign government, any foreign government, places an individual under federal obligations for public disclosure. And Bondi knew this. The record shows it. Yet the very first instinct she demonstrated under pressure was to soften, rebrand, and recontextualize her involvement. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated. Accountability relies on transparency. Transparency relies on honesty. And honesty relies on the willingness of public officials to tell the truth even when it is inconvenient. Bondi's reluctance to acknowledge her own registration under FARA signaled a deeper fear. That open admission would expose a conflict of interest with consequences far beyond the hearing room. Because at the heart of this questioning was not merely whether Bondi represented Qatar. It was whether that representation influenced her decisions in her role as Attorney General. Whether her past relationship with the Qatari government played any part, directly or indirectly, in the administration's acceptance of a $400 million luxury jet, a gift from Qatar intended explicitly for President Trump. Under the Constitution, foreign gifts of such magnitude require congressional review. They demand scrutiny because they raise immediate questions of influence, leverage, intention, and national interest. Yet the administration brushed all of this aside, treating a foreign government's extravagant offering as a matter of personal preference. It was prettier, the president reportedly said. The casualness of that justification belied the gravity of the ethical implications. And this is where the hearing became more than theater. It became a lesson in how corruption often operates in modern governance. It is rarely a briefcase of cash slipped under a table. More often, it is a quiet accommodation of power, the bending of rules to suit personal desires, the failure to disclose conflicts, the softening of truth, and the strategic use of silence to prevent public understanding. Dean's interrogation exposed these mechanisms for what they were. And Bondi, unable to provide substantive answers, resorted instead to personal attacks, accusing Dean of misrepresenting her words, insulting her professionalism, and attempting to frame the questioning as partisan aggression rather than legitimate oversight. But the American public watching saw something different. They saw an attorney general struggling to hold together a narrative that could not withstand simple factual inquiry. They saw a senior official evading questions not because the answers were classified, but because the answers were politically dangerous. They saw clearly the widening gap between the administration's rhetoric of lawfulness and its actual behavior behind closed doors. To be silenced and expose the evasions for what they were. Her insistence was not aggression. It was discipline, the very discipline required to confront power that has grown accustomed to skating past the truth. What makes this hearing segment especially important is that it bridges two interconnected themes: the undermining of the rule of law through political favoritism, and the erosion of ethical standards through undisclosed foreign entanglements. These are not isolated issues. They are symptoms of the same deeper problem, a worldview within the administration that political loyalty is more important than legal integrity, and personal desire more important than constitutional duty. The result is a Department of Justice that finds itself compromised not by external threat, but by internal decay. A system meant to be impartial has become, instead, a mechanism shaped by the preferences of those who hold power. And when the Attorney General demonstrates through her words, actions, and omissions that she cannot or will not defend the foundational principles of transparency, independence, and honesty, the integrity of the entire system is put at risk. The hearing, in its rawest form, showed a clash between two visions of government. One vision, represented by Dean, insists that public service requires accountability, humility, and a willingness to confront difficult truths. The other, represented by Bondi, reflect a mindset in which scrutiny is treated as insult, hard questions as disloyalty, and transparency as optional. This is why the confrontation matters. Not because of the raised voices, the interruptions, or the personal barbs, but because of what the exchange revealed about the state of American governance. Corruption, as Dean later emphasized, is not always loud. It is often quiet, procedural, even polite. It can hide behind legal language, bureaucratic phrasing, or claims of privileged conversations. It can disguise itself as expertise, or as routine, or as necessity. But hearings like this shine a light on these subtleties. They show the public where norms are slipping, where ethics are being compromised, where influence is quietly reshaping policy. And that is why documenting moments like this, amplifying them, analyzing them, refusing to let them vanish beneath the relentless churn of the news cycle, is essential to democratic vigilance. As the hearing progressed, the tension in the room thickened, not because of theatrics, but because a veneer of institutional decorum was steadily peeling away. Every time Representative Dean pushed forward with a direct, fact-based question, Attorney General Bondi pivoted to evasion, emotional defensiveness, or attempts to redefine the terms of discussion. It was a revealing dynamic. Oversight functioning exactly as designed, confronting a public official who seemed genuinely unprepared or unwilling to meet the basic expectations of her job. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the hearing transformed from a routine inquiry into a crystallizing moment of national significance. A clear shift occurred when Dean returned to one of the simplest questions posed that day, whether Bondi had disclosed her work for Qatar during her Senate confirmation. A yes or no question, black and white, straightforward. Yet Bondi swerved again. She began insisting that the matter had been discussed, implying transparency without ever acknowledging the core issue, that she herself had not disclosed it voluntarily. It was only mentioned when senators raised it, when they confronted her with the documentation. The distinction matters because disclosure is an act of initiative, not reaction. True transparency is proactive. It exists before the questioning, not after officials are cornered. Bondi's tactic was subtle but unmistakable. Blur the difference between being confronted with a conflict and willingly revealing it. It's a tactic that mirrors a broader institutional pattern, one where those in power attempt to redefine what honesty looks like so the public cannot see where the ethical lines have been crossed. But Dean did not allow that blurring to stand. Her insistence on precision, that disclosure means self-reporting, not being caught, cut sharply through the ambiguity Bondi tried to construct. And in that moment, the public saw something important. Honesty in government depends not only on what is said, but on when and why it is said. This question-answer pattern revealed a structural vulnerability in the Justice Department under Bondi's leadership. When the top legal authority in the nation cannot clearly articulate her own compliance with ethics rules, how can the public trust that she is enforcing those rules impartially across the government? How can civil servants trust that their adherence to ethical guidelines will be respected when the Attorney General herself appears to treat them as nuisances rather than obligations? What happens to whistleblowers, investigators, and career lawyers inside the DOJ when the tone from the top signals that transparency is a negotiable virtue? These are not theoretical concerns. They shape the entire culture of federal governance. Leadership determines whether ethical standards are upheld rigidly or bent casually. Officials watch how the Attorney General navigates scrutiny, and they take their cues accordingly. If she evades, they feel freer to evade. If she dismisses conflict as trivial, they learn that compliance is optional. And so institutional erosion begins, quietly and steadily. This erosion was visible in another significant moment of the hearing, the debate over Qatari jet. It is difficult to overstate the constitutional implications of a foreign government providing a luxury aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the President of the United States. This is precisely the kind of situation the founders feared, a foreign nation gaining influence through lavish gifts that blur the line between diplomacy and personal benefit. Yet when Dean pressed Bondi on whether she had advised the president on the legality of accepting the jet, Bondi again retreated behind the shield of confidentiality, refusing to answer even in the most general sense. Her refusal raised deeper questions than the one Dean asked. It forced the public to confront a disturbing possibility. What if the law was applied not to protect the country from foreign influence, but to protect the president from political fallout? What if legal guidance was shaped not by constitutional principle, but by personal loyalty? What if the Attorney General's silence wasn't about procedure, but about complicity? These questions lingered in the air, unspoken yet unmistakably present. And in the vacuum left by Bondi's refusal, the public was left to connect the dots. A foreign government with immense strategic interests offers an extraordinary gift. The president expresses personal enthusiasm for the gift. The Attorney General, who previously worked for that same foreign government, refuses to say whether she advised him about accepting it. And the Justice Department, the institution tasked with safeguarding the rule of law, provides no clarity. Even if every action taken were technically legal, the optics alone are corrosive. They undermine confidence, fuel suspicion, and create a shadow over the integrity of government decision-making. When transparency is withheld, trust collapses. When conflict of interest are minimized instead of addressed, the public is left to assume the worst. And when the Attorney General refuses to confirm even the basics of ethical recusal, it sends a chilling message. The boundary between public duty and private loyalty has become dangerously thin. This is where Dean's questioning became more than oversight. It became a public service. She exposed not simply what Bondi did or didn't do, but the fragility of the ethical framework that should guide public officials. The hearing became a lens through which Americans could see how easily transparency is eroded when those at the top decide the rules do not apply to them. What made the exchange even more telling was Bondi's reaction to being challenged. Rather than offering facts, she shifted to indignation. Rather than clarifying her record, she accused Dean of mischaracterizing her intentions. Rather than acknowledging legitimate concerns, she framed the scrutiny as disrespect. These tactics are familiar. They are hallmarks of defensive politics, where emotional appeal is used to obscure substantive accountability.
But these tactics also fail to withstand close examination because they reveal far more about the evasive official than about the person asking the questions. Bondi's reactions underscored the fragility of her narrative. The more Dean pressed for clarity, the more unstable Bondi's answers became. She contradicted herself, insisted on interpretations inconsistent with documented facts, and floated explanations shaped more by public image than by legal accuracy. And each time she pushed back with indignation, it highlighted just how deeply she felt the pressure of scrutiny. This is where viewers were reminded of a central truth. Confident, ethical officials do not fear transparency. They do not struggle to explain their decisions. They do not lash out when asked simple questions. They do not rely on ambiguity. They do not treat oversight as insult. They do not hide behind procedural shields unless the substance is indefensible. Bondi's inability to offer clear answers conveyed something profoundly important, that the administration's ethical framework is built not on principles, but on personal loyalty and curated narrative. When the narrative is challenged, the structure collapses, revealing inconsistencies, gaps, and contradictions that cannot withstand sustained inquiry. One of the most striking contradictions emerged when the conversation returned to the January 6th pardons. Bondi repeatedly emphasized her commitment to law enforcement, to protecting officers, to maintaining order. Yet she could not reconcile that claim with the administration's decision to pardon every individual charged for their role in an attack that left multiple officers dead or traumatized. The contradiction was not merely rhetorical, it was moral. Dean's reference to her own Capitol Police friends, officers who endured trauma and loss on January 6th, grounded the discussion in human reality. Law enforcement is not an abstract concept. It is men and women who put their lives on the line daily, who suffered violence from the very individuals the administration later pardoned. To profess support for those officers while excusing the actions of their attackers is not simply inconsistent. It is an insult to every person who defended the Capitol that day. When Bondi failed to address this contradiction, it revealed the limits of her position. She could not defend the pardons on moral grounds. She could not justify them legally without undermining the administration's narrative. And she could not acknowledge their political motivations without exposing the administration to legitimate accusations of corruption. Her only option was silence. This silence, strategic, guarded, and calculated, became the most damning answer of all. Not because it confirmed wrongdoing, but because it confirmed fear. Fear of acknowledging a truth that would shatter the administration's claims of integrity. Fear of admitting that political loyalty had superseded legal principle. Fear of exposing the Justice Department as an institution that, under her leadership, bends to political will rather than upholding the rule of law. The confrontation between Dean and Bondi illuminated one more essential reality. Corruption is not always loud or theatrical. It often appears as hesitation, as selective memory, as refusal to answer simple questions. It appears as the intentional fog created by powerful individuals who hope that confusion will hide the truth. It appears in the quiet ways officials protect themselves and their allies rather than the public interest. And that is why hearings like this matter, because they strip away that fog. They make evasion visible. They reveal which officials embrace transparency and which run from it. They demonstrate, in real time, the difference between service and self-preservation. By the time Part 2 of this segment closes, one thing has become unmistakably clear. The crisis exposed in this hearing is not merely about one decision, one foreign relationship, or one pardon. It is about the integrity of the Justice Department itself. It is about whether the American people can trust that those who wield enormous power do so in accordance with the law, not their own interests. It is about whether the ethical guardrails designed to protect democracy are still intact, or whether they have been quietly moved aside. What began with a simple question had, by this point in the hearing, expanded into an indictment of the entire apparatus of accountability within the administration. And the American public, watching as this confrontation unfolded, witnessed not only the evasions of one official but the troubling decay of an entire system that depends on honesty to function. By the time the hearing reached its midpoint, the dynamic between Representative Dean and Attorney General Bondi had crystallized into something larger than a clash of personalities. It had become a living demonstration of the tension between democratic transparency and the instinctive secrecy of power. Every exchange revealed a new layer of how institutional accountability fractures when senior officials guard not the truth, but the administration's political interests. The room could feel it, a subtle shift from procedural oversight to something far more profound, an uncomfortable confrontation with the fragility of the nation's ethical guardrails. At this point, the witnesses and lawmakers were no longer simply debating facts. They were navigating the deeper moral implications of governance, what it means to hold power responsibly, what it means to answer to the public, what it means to embody the rule of law. Dean's questions were pointed because the stakes were high, not personal, but institutional. And Bondi's evasions were telling because they illuminated how difficult it becomes to defend decisions that conflict with the foundational ideals of justice. One of the clearest demonstrations of this moment came when Dean revisited Bondi's earlier claim that she had never failed to uphold ethical standards. The assertion, delivered with confidence, collided sharply with the documented reality that certain foreign engagements, specifically her professional work for Qatar, had not been proactively disclosed during her confirmation process. Dean, still composed but increasingly direct, pointed out the gap between the Attorney General's self-presentation and the public record. And once again, Bondi attempted to evade the central issue by redefining the terms. In doing so, she revealed a habit common among officials under scrutiny, the belief that reframing a fact can substitute for addressing it. Yet the distinction between reframing and responding is crucial. Reframing transforms the narrative, responding clarifies it. And what the public saw in that room was an attorney general much more comfortable reshaping the narrative than acknowledging the conflict plainly. This distinction is vital to understand because it reflects the broader pattern of how political institutions drift away from transparency. The erosion does not happen in dramatic bursts. It happens incrementally, through semantic maneuvering, through selective disclosure, through the gradual normalization of ambiguity. Over time, these subtle shifts create a culture where clarity is optional and accountability is negotiable. The hearing exposed this cultural drift with unusual sharpness.
This drift became even clearer when Dean pressed Bondi on whether she had recused herself from matters involving Qatar, a necessary step for any official with prior ties to a foreign government. Recusal is not punitive. It is protective. It ensures that decisions affecting the nation's global relationships remain untainted by personal or financial interests. Yet Bondi could provide no straightforward confirmation of recusal. Her refusal to address the question, even in broad procedural terms, left the public wondering whether such protections had been disregarded, overlooked, or dismissed altogether. The significance of this cannot be overstated. An attorney general's ethical boundaries are not merely personal responsibilities. They shape the public's perception of the entire Justice Department. If the attorney general cannot show that she operated with full impartiality, it raises questions about the impartiality of every major decision made under her leadership. Trust in the DOJ is built not only on the correctness of its rulings, but on the confidence that those rulings are free from bias. When that confidence cracks at the top, it reverberates downward through the entire institution. The hearing also revealed something else. That Bondi appeared genuinely surprised by the intensity of the oversight she faced. This reaction reflected a broader problem. The expectation among certain officials that scrutiny is a formality rather than a substantive responsibility. But oversight is not symbolic. It is a constitutional obligation. It is one of the few mechanisms the public has to ensure that power is wielded responsibly. When officials act as though scrutiny is an inconvenience rather than a duty, it reflects a troubling misunderstanding of democracy's foundational principles. In Bondi's responses, this misunderstanding was on full display. Several times she accused Dean of putting words in her mouth, even when Dean was quoting verbatim from publicly available records. Several times she claimed the questioning was unprofessional, even though oversight hearings are designed to probe uncomfortable truths. Several times she insisted that Dean's inquiries were inappropriate, when in reality they were anchored in established ethics statutes, constitutional guidelines, and publicly documented events. These reactions, rather than deflecting criticism, only reinforced the perception that Bondi was uneasy in a space where accountability demands collided with political realities. The more she resisted basic questions, the more the public could see the widening gap between the administration's promises of transparency and the actual behavior of its highest legal officer. This gap widened even further when the hearing touched the emotional terrain of January 6. Dean's voice carried the weight of lived experience. The trauma of speaking with officers who fought for hours against violent rioters, the pain of knowing some did not survive, the frustration of seeing their suffering minimized by political rhetoric. Her questions did not emerge from partisan strategy. They emerged from a profound sense of duty to those who risked their lives defending democracy. Bondi, however, was never able to reconcile the administration's position with its actions. She reiterated standard lines about supporting law enforcement, but avoided the undeniable contradiction. How could the administration defend officers while excusing those who harmed them? How could it uphold the rule of law while issuing pardons that effectively nullified the consequences of one of the most violent attacks on American institutions in modern history? This contradiction was so stark that silence became the only possible response. And in that silence, the truth became unmistakable. The administration's commitment to law enforcement was conditional, a political tool, not a governing principle. The pardons were not expressions of justice. They were expressions of loyalty. And Bondi's inability to articulate any moral or legal justification for these pardons underscored the fragility of the administration's ethical foundation. The most revealing aspect of this moment was not the content of Bondi's silence, but the discomfort that preceded it. She hesitated. She struggled. She deflected. She sighed. She repeated familiar lines rather than addressing the question. These behaviors communicated more than any direct answer could have. They conveyed that the administration's decision could not be defended without exposing deeper inconsistencies. Inconsistencies between its rhetoric of justice and its practice of political favoritism. These inconsistencies accumulate, piece by piece, until they form a pattern. And patterns are powerful because they reveal systemic issues rather than isolated incidents. This pattern, as Dean laid it out through her questions, suggested a Justice Department adrift from its foundational purpose, a department increasingly shaped by political priorities rather than legal imperatives. The audience watching, both in the hearing room and across the country, witnessed this pattern unfold. They saw an attorney general who spoke fluently about her commitment to justice, but struggled to explain basic ethical decisions. They saw a public servant who claimed to uphold the rule of law, yet avoided discussing the administration's most legally consequential actions. They saw someone who spoke passionately about her dedication to transparency, while refusing to provide transparency when it mattered most. This is why the hearing resonated so deeply. It was not only about the specific controversies surrounding Qatar, or the pardons, or the conflict disclosures. It was about what these controversies represented. A Justice Department whose moral compass appeared compromised, whose institutional integrity seemed weakened, and whose leadership was unable to reconcile professed values with political reality. As Part 3 draws to a close, one pivotal truth emerges clearly. This hearing did not expose a single failure. It exposed a system of failures. It showed how ethics erode, how institutions bend under political pressure, how transparency is replaced with performative openness, how accountability depends not on the willingness of officials to tell the truth, but on the determination of lawmakers to demand it. And because of that, the hearing serves as a warning that without persistent, unyielding oversight, democratic institutions do not collapse with a loud crash. They corrode quietly, subtly, invisibly. Corruption is not always aggressive. Sometimes it's passive, manifesting through avoidance, silence, and the steady normalization of unethical practices. The confrontation between Dean and Bondi made this danger visible. But visibility is only the first step. Recognition must be followed by action, analysis, and public engagement. That is the role of this narrative, this segment, this entire project. To ensure that moments of public importance are not lost to the daily churn of news and distraction. To understand the stakes of that confrontation, one must understand the architecture surrounding it. A political environment where influence operates through unseen channels, where accountability is often exception rather than the norm, and where transparency has become a curated performance instead of a governing principle. In this landscape, the Bondi hearing was not an isolated political moment. It was a window into the broader transformation of democratic institutions under the pressure of concentrated power. Modern corruption is not defined by the crude exchanges of past decades. It no longer relies solely on envelopes of cash or discreet favors whispered in parking garages. Instead, it often takes shape to what the public rarely sees. Foreign partnerships that shift from consultant to influence, private gifts masked as diplomatic gestures, ethical rules treated as optional guidelines rather than binding constraints, political loyalty rewarded above professional integrity, and public institutions repurposed to defend leaders instead of the Constitution. What unfolded in the hearing was a perfect storm of these forces converging. Consider the issue of foreign influence, a subject often spoken about in abstractions, but one that became jarringly concrete when Qatar entered the conversation. When Representative Dean pressed Bondi about her previous representation of the Qatari government, she was not nitpicking a technical disclosure error. She was illuminating the doorway through which foreign governments can quietly influence American policy. That doorway is not created by espionage or covert operations. It is created by relationships, professional, personal, financial, that embed themselves into careers of powerful officials long before they enter government. Foreign governments understand this. They have studied the American system for decades. They know that influence is not always purchased directly. It is cultivated. It is fostered through soft power, through prestigious contracts, through access, through mutual benefit, through carefully timed generosity, such as the offering of a luxury jet that carries both symbolic meaning and potential leverage. These gestures are not technically illegal, but they are strategically potent. They test the boundaries of American ethics laws, exploiting ambiguities and loopholes that were written for a very different era. This is why Bondi's refusal to discuss her involvement with the jet controversy mattered so deeply. It revealed an underlying fragility, that our constitutional safeguards against foreign influence depend heavily on the ethical discipline of the individuals entrusted to uphold them. When those individuals remain silent or vague or defensive, it becomes impossible to trust that the system is functioning as designed. The founders warned about the dangers of foreign entanglements not because they mistrusted other nations, but because they understood human nature, how easily power can be compromised when personal interest, vanity, or political loyalty comes into play. Dean's questioning made this dynamic visible. It revealed how a single undisclosed relationship can become the weak point in a much larger chain of national decisions. The issue was not simply whether Bondi had worked for Qatar years earlier. The issue was how that past relationship intersected with her present role, how it shaped her judgment, how it influenced her approach to executive privilege, how it affected her ability to serve as the nation's top legal officer without conflict of interest or the appearance of conflict, which in governance is often just as damaging as the reality. Appearances matter because trust is founded not only on what officials do, but on what the public believes they might do. When transparency is withheld, people assume the worst, and when officials appear to hide information, even if no wrongdoing occurred, the institution suffers. This is why recusal, disclosure, and ethical clarity exist, not to punish officials, but to protect them, to ensure that their work is insulated from suspicion, from conflict, from the slow erosion of legitimacy. Bondi's handling of these issues illustrated how modern corruption often thrives. Through opacity, through strategic silence, through the quiet assumption that the public will forget or that lawmakers will eventually move on. But what the hearing proved, what Segment 2 aims to make clear, is that influence has a lifespan far longer than any official hopes. Foreign governments remember their relationships, their investments, their gestures, and those relationships can become leverage long after the public conversation has moved on. Yet foreign influence is only one piece of the architecture. Another is the internal ecosystem of political incentives that has made loyalty, not lawfulness, the currency of advancement in certain administrations. The moment an attorney general begins to see their role not as a guardian of constitutional principles, but as a defender of the president's political narrative, the Justice Department shifts from being a protector of the public to a protector of power. This shift is subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it reshapes the entire institution. Signs of this shift were evident throughout Bondi's testimony. Her reluctance to acknowledge conflicts, her defensiveness when challenged, her insistence on framing oversight as disrespect. Each of these behaviors indicated an internal culture in which challenging power is discouraged and shielding power is normalized. The danger of such a culture is immense. It fosters an environment where career officials may feel pressure to align their legal interpretations with political expectations, where dissent becomes risky, where ethical standards are seen not as obligations, but as inconveniences. This culture does not emerge spontaneously. It is cultivated by leadership, by what leaders reward, what they tolerate, what they punish. If leaders dismiss ethics inquiries as partisan attacks, their subordinates learn to treat ethics casually. If leaders punish those who raise concerns, others learn to stay silent. If leaders reward loyalty above integrity, professional neutrality collapses. And once neutrality collapses, justice becomes variable, dependent not on the law but on who holds power. This is why the January 6 pardons are so central to understanding the architecture of modern corruption. They were not just political decisions. They were signals. Signals to supporters that political loyalty would outweigh violence. Signals to officials that the rule of law was flexible. Signals to the Justice Department that its authority depended on political alignment rather than constitutional mandate. When an administration issues blanket pardons for individuals involved in an attack on its own legislature, it fundamentally disrupts the moral hierarchy of governance. Bondi, whether intentionally or not, became the embodiment of this disruption. Her silence on the pardons was not simply a refusal to elaborate. It was an acknowledgement of a new doctrine, that certain actions, no matter how destabilizing, are beyond scrutiny if they serve political ends. And in this doctrine lies the most dangerous form of corruption, the normalization of impunity. Impunity is the enemy of democracy. It tells officials they can bend rules without consequence. It tells supporters they are above the law if their cause is aligned with the administration. It tells the public that the system is no longer neutral. It creates two tiers of justice, one for insiders and one for everyone else. But this hearing and segment 2's exploration of it reveals something else as well, that impunity only thrives in darkness. The hearing dragged these issues into the light. It exposed how influence, loyalty, and silence intertwine to create a system where accountability becomes nearly impossible. It showed that corruption is not always intentional. Sometimes it is a natural outcome of a system built on incentives that reward the wrong behaviors. Segment 2 is fundamentally about that system, about understanding the environment that produced the evasions of Segment 1, the defensive rhetoric, the inconsistencies, the refusal to answer basic questions. Because to understand behavior of one official, we must understand the incentives shaping that behavior. And those incentives did not begin with Pam Bondi. They are woven into the deeper fabric of political power in America.